Desirable difficulties. Kind of sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? But actually, it's the core of good practice. What is desirable difficulty? Well, this is a psychological principle that basically adding challenges to our learning can help the learning be more durable and more efficient. Why this matters to us as pianists and piano teachers is that we can improve more quickly. We can help our students improve more quickly if we understand how to add desirable difficulties to practice and to lessons. This term, desirable difficulties, was coined by psychologist Robert Bjork, and it helps to explain why learning strategies that seem challenging actually enhance our learning in the long run. So some general examples for you so you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes we will insert spaced repetition between goes at something. So let's say we're playing basketball and we're trying to shoot a layup. We could just practice that layup again and again and again in a row for hours. Or we could practice it a few times, then do something else, and then go back to it. When we do that, it feels harder. It feels like we're making less progress because we had some time to forget. But actually, our results are going to be better. We're going to learn how to do that layup and remember the process of the physical movements. They'll be more baked in every time we go to do it in the future. Now, how can we do this with the piano? Well, we can do different rhythms. That's really what we're doing with rhythms in a lot of cases. So this is the most common practice strategy that many people will cite, especially when we get to more intermediate repertoire and above, is playing with different rhythms. Say we have a passage that is entirely quavers or eighth notes, like a scale passage. We can play that with different rhythms, like a dotted pattern or whatever pattern we like, in order to vary things a little bit. Now, I think this has two benefits. Part of it is if we do dotted rhythms, which is the most common, let's say we're practicing a scale and we do it with a dotted rhythm and then we reverse the dotted rhythm. So it goes long, short, and then the second time it goes short, long in that pattern. What we're really doing is we're practicing playing 50% of the notes faster. So it has that benefit as well, but it also has the benefit of forcing us to concentrate. Scales in particular can be minefield for students just shutting off their brain. You just sort of go on autopilot and do whatever and make the same fingering mistake and further teach yourself how to make that mistake instead of play the correct fingering, and on and on and on. It can become a bit of a drudgery, but one that's hard to break out of. And so these rhythm variations really help with that because you have to concentrate because you're not doing it the same way you always do. Now, if we did it with the same silly rhythm every time, well, then we have the same issue because it's not difficult. So we have to introduce newness, freshness, and fresh difficulty all the time to keep ourselves focused and concentrating and keep our brain learning that pattern in new ways to make the learning more durable. Another way to do this is interleaved practice. This is something we promote in our Vivid Practice app, so you've probably heard me talk about it before, but in case you haven't, when we do interleaved practice, we don't practice all piece A, and then all piece B, and then all piece C. We do a little piece A, and then a little of piece B, and then we might go back to piece A, and then to piece C. So we're splitting up our practice into smaller chunks and revisiting things throughout our practice session. In this way, making this practice lasagna, you actually make better progress and faster progress with your pieces. Now, it feels harder, and that's on purpose. So it's not necessarily for every student, but it is a strategy that really works, and many studies now have proven that this strategy works. We also might do some kind of self-testing. So let's say, we'll take it out of piano for a second, let's say you were trying to learn a new language. Let's say Spanish. You might be learning new vocabulary, and so you would make flashcards for yourself or use a flashcard app to drill those new words. And what you're doing there is testing whether you know it. The silliest way to use flashcards is to look at the front and go, and look at the back and go, yeah, and just feel like, yeah, I probably knew that. Have you been there? I know I have. We do this more commonly with something like, studying history or something more more vague, less cut and dry than something like a language, but I think some people do it with languages too. When we're self-testing, we have to say out loud what we think that word means or what we think the word for that is, and then check our answer. And again, we test ourselves. We try and recall the information, and we either succeed or we fail, and we review it, and we try again. That's what self-testing is. And most piano students don't do enough of it. So if you're trying to memorize a piece, you should, as the first task of your practice every day, see how much of you can remember before you look in your book, right? You shouldn't practice your scales if you're going to have to play them from memory with the sheet music in front of you or the diagrams or reminders in front of you. You need to test yourself and then be honest about what went wrong and then look at it again. And then test yourself and then be honest about what went wrong. And that is how we make stronger connections. But again, it's a desirable difficulty. It makes your learning stronger, but it feels harder, so it's harder to get yourself to do. We can also introduce desirable difficulty by varying our environment. This is something we do a lot in my studio before a concert or an exam or anything like that. We have them play on different pianos because we have 2 different teaching rooms and each has 2 different pianos. So they should play on all of those pianos, because just shifting where you play and what you do, what's around you, what the keys feel like, all that stuff is going to make it that little bit more difficult to play at your best. You can also have them do this at home, playing on random pianos they find when they're out and about in people's houses, or if you have like pianos in a shopping center or in a train station, as we have in many places here, maybe they have to play it on those. Or you can just move things around in your own home and vary what things look like. You can dim the lights and see if you're still able to play, because maybe you're going to be playing in an environment later which doesn't have super bright practice room lighting, right? So different ways of varying how you're playing and where you're playing can make a big difference. And the final example I'll give, because you could just think of endless examples of how to make things more difficult in little ways, is pushing yourself on the tempo. And this is both directions, so I want to be super clear. You could be making things more difficult by forcing yourself to play slowly. Or you could be making things more difficult by making it faster. But I want to be very clear that we don't just gradually get faster and faster with our pieces. Our practice should vary in tempo. That's how we make durable learning stick for that piece. We don't just play it at an ever-increasing tempo until we reach the performance tempo and then stick there and never play it at any other speed. That's not a recipe for success. It doesn't work, okay? But we can push ourselves to play faster or push ourselves to play really slowly. That is tough too, and will make a difference to how difficult our practice feels, and therefore how much we have to focus, and therefore how much we learn. This video is brought to you by Vivid Practice. Keeping students accountable doesn't have to be complicated. Vividpractice.com helps music teachers manage assignments effortlessly while encouraging smarter practice habits. With an intuitive teacher portal, progress tracking, and built-in messaging, you get all the tools that matter without the extra fuss. Designed by music teachers for music teachers. Sign up for free at vividpractice.com and simplify your studio today. Now we have to come back to the first word. Desirable. This isn't always desirable. In fact, a lot of the time, it's not. It's desirable for your learning progress, but in the moment, it is not desirable. It is the opposite of what you want to do in many cases. You don't want to make things harder for yourself. You just want to do whatever and call it a day. So how do we convince students to actually introduce desirable difficulty in their practice? First of all, I will say, this is not for beginners. I talk a lot about making things as easy as possible for students in the first couple of years of lessons. It's not about pushing them. Unless you have a particular kind of student who that's appropriate, that's your judgment. But in general, things for beginners should feel plain sailing easy. We should be structuring the learning so that they don't face these big difficulties. Because what we want them to build in their practice time is a steady practice habit. That is it. That's all I want in the first couple of years. I want them to practice consistently. They don't have to practice in the best possible way. They just have to sit down 5 days a week, ideally, and play all of their things. And they can play those in whatever way they like, honestly. It's good with me, unless they're making super speedy progress and they're way ahead in levels, and then we will start talking about practice strategies. But in the beginning, at least for the first year, in many cases too, considering that I'm mostly talking about young beginner students, because most students start very young here with us, I just want them to play each thing like 3 times each, and that's it. That's fine. Their pieces are not very long. They will get better if they do that. Yes, I might give them some practice strategies like tapping out the rhythm and doing this and doing that, and that's great. But really, I wanted logic behind those strategies. The reason I ask them to tap the rhythm before they play it is to make it easier for them to play, not to introduce a desirable difficulty. Okay? So, first of all, it's not for beginners. Second of all, you have to practice what you preach. If you don't do these things in lessons, you have no chance of your student doing them at home. You can't just say to them, okay, at home, I want you to play this with dotted rhythms with your left hand crossed over your right hand and blah, blah, blah. Did you do it in the lesson? If not, and if the student hasn't been doing these kinds of things for a long time, they're not going to do it at home. I'm so sorry, they're not. And another thing about that, though, because sometimes teachers, they end up writing out the practice instructions. And believe me, I've been here, okay? They end up writing out the practice instructions or telling them what to do quickly because they run out of time. Okay, you've run out of time. I get it. We all run out of time. You maybe have a 30-minute lesson or 45-minute lesson or an hour, whatever the case may be, you'll still run out of time. Even if it's 30 minutes, if you have a beginner and they're in 30-minute lessons, how long do you think their practice is at home? Is it really more than 30 minutes? Because if it's not more than 30 minutes, then how can they find time to do at home what you couldn't possibly find time to do in the lesson? Now look, I know you're doing other stuff in the lesson, I do get that, but I think we need to be realistic. If a beginner student is practicing 5 days a week for 15 minutes, which honestly would be pretty good going in many studios, we have to be realistic about what fits in that time versus our lesson time. And if we're running out of time to even run through all of their assignments, they've got too many things. They're not going to practice them all. Be realistic about it and make sure you're not trying to force desirable difficulties onto beginner practice, because I just think that's a recipe for frustration and quitting. Once we get beyond that beginner stage, though, it does start to be really important. And especially with adult students, it could happen earlier. The best way I've found to convince students about this concept is to really just explain their brain to them. A lot of students find this really interesting and they straight away get it. Now, you don't have to have a neuroscience PhD to explain the brain in the way I'm talking about. And you can definitely do it in your own words. Do a little bit of research about, how we learn things and neural pathways and explain it whatever way you like. I like to use the idea of a path or a road, and I often have them visualize it as going from one side of the brain to the other. So it's going from here to here. And that's the path that your brain needs to take to play this line of the piece correctly, or whatever the case may be. Now, if we only do that path once, your brain just erases it. It just rubs it out behind you because it's thinking, yeah, but I only have so much space for paths, so I don't need to keep that one. And then you do it again, and it's like, okay, I'll kind of remember that route, yeah. And then you do it again and again and again, and you're wearing in this path as if you're walking through a forest, and again you walk over the same area, and so that becomes a path where it was just random leaves and debris. So little images like that I find can make a big difference. And the desirable difficulty thing helps your brain to really steady footprints on that path and put it in place really firmly. It also helps to talk about the difference between practicing and playing, what each one is, and some kind of decision on their part about which one they are doing. We explain practicing versus playing, and if we're practicing, I tend to say, if you're practicing, you're working hard to solve a problem or something like that. You're trying to get better. If you're playing, you're just playing. You're just enjoying the piece and you're playing it whatever way you want to play it, and that's fine. Playing is not wrong. Playing is great. But it's not practicing. And so if you sit down and you're really tired that day and you just want to play piano to let off some steam, or you're having a tough time and you're frustrated and you just want to relax, and you're using piano for that, amazing. You just play during your practice time and that is fine. But you can't just play every day. You have to practice during your practice time, and that means you have to be working hard to solve a problem or to achieve a goal, right? So simple little explanations like this, and not done all at once, but sprinkled out over time, can help students to understand this concept of desirable difficulties, practicing with a strategy, with a plan, with a purpose behind what they're doing, not just doing whatever and calling it a day.